Boys television series, an extremely grotesque, vulgar as possible superhero satire based on the comic book of the same name, recently wrapped up its 7-year run. To some very mixed results. Honestly, that seems to be the norm with TV show finales nowadays. Now, while a lot of people say that the show fell off in later seasons, I might have some hot takes about the show and the comic book that I wanted to talk about here in this video today. So let me explain. You don't really have a choice in the matter because here I am explaining. Going to the origin of the comic series that started it all, we have to look at its creator, Garth Ennis. Prior to creating this series here, Ennis worked on many superhero comics, most notably The Punisher, who he still works on occasionally today, but even then, these hero characters were usually depicted as ridiculous and ineffectual at best in his work. At worst, he literally wrote Punisher Kills the Marvel Universe and created the team Section 8 for DC Comics, named after the US military designation of being too mentally unfit to serve, and features such iconic characters as serial rapist Bueno Excelente and dog welder. You can probably guess what he does with dogs and welding. As you might imagine, despite his work on various superhero comics, he doesn't really seem to hold them in high esteem, except for Superman. He seems to like Superman. But this can be understandable to an extent. As a native of Ireland, Ennis didn't grow up fond of superhero comics, just like many other European writers who often deconstruct the genre as opposed to how American writers handle it. For instance, you can think of Alan Moore's Watchmen. The difference is, a lot of Ennis's work takes it to the extremist of extreme, to such a point that it can feel unpleasantly vulgar and mean-spirited towards the superhero genre that it's inhabiting. That statement right there is how I would sum up a lot of the Boys comic. It's not so much if superheroes were real, but if they were the worst people ever. Although, you could say that that is realistic. I mean, take a look at how the world is and the kind of people that have held power throughout. Rarely would they be considered morally good, whether that means they were evil before seizing the power, or the act of power itself is what corrupts. The latter often being the main critique of superheroes and their authoritarianism. Now, in case you're watching this video and you don't actually know what The Boys is about, I should probably explain that. It would have been better if I put this at the start, but I don't feel like going back and adding that. I'll explain it here. Essentially, the story of both the comic and the show is that we follow a secret CIA group colloquially named The Boys as they target superheroes, mostly from the Big Vought Corporation, to combat and even kill them. As it would turn out, the superheroes of this world aren't so pure-hearted, rather corrupted by the depths of greed and depravity as any other human being, just with the wealth and power to exercise their desires whenever and however they want. Now, considering that plots demand climaxes, things get more and more absurd as the series goes on, so even the grossness of the start is eclipsed by how disturbing things get by the end. So gross, in fact, that I'm not even really sure what I can show from the comics, or even what I should show from it, because I'm not trying to make you vomit after all. Even though I do think that it takes things too far and in my opinion ends up boiling down to a sort of vapid compilation of like the worst crimes against humanity guest starring some superheroes, I like that there is something this far on the end of the spectrum. I just appreciate that it exists. I should let you all know as well that I did first read some of this comic series a very long time ago, so I've had a lot of time to think about it more over the years. And you know, I'm not so sure that this is really a criticism of the superhero genre specifically. It's clear that Ennis has some issues with superheroes, but when you take into account the fact that he has chosen of his own free will to write superhero comics on numerous occasions, alongside how edgy a lot of his other work is, like Preacher and Crossed, I come more to the conclusion that it's less about portraying superheroes as grotesque and just writing a comic about how bad they are and how much they suck, and more about the evil behind these massive corporations and military complexes that would use superheroes as a positive facing image if they were to exist in that world. Sort of like how the comic industry itself is kind of held in a chokehold by the superhero genre because it's so popular, and they use that for their popularity. Very different situations, but superheroes are popular is what I'm saying. So as I've had time to digest the Boys comic over the years, I still find it to be a not very fun read a lot of the time, even if there are goofy and yes, sincere moments that are often overlooked, to enjoy the comic due to how gross it intends on being most of the time, and also the fact that it just seems too cynical after a while. However, the time I've had to think about it has given me more of an understanding that it isn't so much blind hatred of comics' most popular genre like a lot of people write this off to be, but criticism of unchecked power, celebrity worship, and a glimpse at how truly perverted people with these powers could act if they were in stories not published by the big top brands. It's kind of crazy to think that anyone would have adapted The Boys into live action. I mean, the books are just so crazy that having people acted out and portrayed in a much more realistic manner just seems absurd to me. The truth is, they'd actually been trying to make a live-action version for years. Like, shortly after the comic series began its run, a film trilogy was in the works from director Adam McKay, known for his comedic and political satire that I think would have fit the vibe of the story, although giving it a theatrical release would have definitely meant it'd have to be toned down to not go full NC-17. Nevertheless, I still wonder how the story would have worked if it was condensed into a smaller runtime. Keep that thought in mind for a little bit. I might touch on that more later, just a little bit. As it would turn out, many years later, a streaming series version of The Boys would be developed by Supernatural creator Eric Kripke and produced by Mega Corporation, oh hey, would you look at that, Amazon, for their Prime service. Now, while this series would cover most of the same ground as the comic, I mean, the concept is pretty much the same minus a bunch of specific differences throughout that I don't really feel like getting into because it isn't all that interesting to discuss here. The fact that it is an adaptation of a comic meant that the focus would less on satirizing comic books, but rather comic book movies and TV shows. On top of shocking audiences with how gruesome and unhinged it is, the fact that the show satirized superhero adaptations just as the MCU was closing the book on the Infinity Saga gave this show the perfect release window. But as I said when discussing the comic, The Boys isn't strictly about superheroes, but about the kind of political and economic hierarchy that would use the image of a superhero to their advantage. And while The Boys comic focused more on some post 9/11 nationalism and military involvement in foreign countries, the show takes the considerably more modern approach of making fun of MAGA. A lot of people out there have criticized the show for being too heavy-handed with its criticism of the modern Republican Party and the Trump regime, but like anyone who's paying attention to the stuff that they're saying in the real world knows that the stuff the show is including really isn't that extreme. The stuff they say in the real world is wild all the time. Of course the show is going to have characters say and do wild things that reflect that, especially a show like The Boys. While some argue whether the political discourse comes off a little strong, the one thing everyone can agree on in comparison to the comic is that the show humanizes the Supes more than the comic. Instead of strictly displaying them as the worst humanity has to offer, the show tends to go more in detail on the events and lifestyle choices that breed narcissism, self-hatred, addiction, and the psychological toll of their upbringing that might make these superpowered people who they are. And even in the case of characters like Queen Maeve and even A-Train, they get their redemption, while some characters like The Deep and Homelander absolutely do not. Since the show just recently ended, I've had a few thoughts in my mind about that whole series, especially why I was never that much into it. Truthfully, I only regularly kept up with the show back when season 1 first aired, but not so much after that. When I really think about it, my major issue with the show comes down to how long it was. I felt like it only should have been maybe a miniseries or the length of that movie trilogy it was originally planned to be. This is a story mostly about scrappy, intelligent humans using their wit to battle an evil superhero corporation. For either side to feel competent or threatening in this conflict means they would have taken each other down much sooner, right? To me, for it to last 5 seasons makes it feel like a lot of this show had to meander around before meaningful things actually happened. Because how has it taken so long for one side to stop, in massive air quotes, the other? You could lobby this criticism against the comic as well, but I feel like a drawn comic book has a higher suspension of disbelief than a live action series. I also think the length of the show really hurts the satire and the edginess. The longer it went on, the less I felt shocked by all the rape, racism, gore, and general awfulness of everything. Same as I felt uninterested in them poking fun at the superhero stuff. It's almost like putting hot sauce on every meal you eat. It's gotta kick at first, but by the end you've built a tolerance for it. And like I've said before, I appreciate that there is a superhero story that is this excessive, but at the same time feel like that excessiveness makes it all feel too much while taking so long for things to actually progress in the grand scheme of things. Another thing that's on my mind, is the show not very similar to what the comic is criticizing? A series that attempts to humanize the monsters, ran much longer than it should have, with setups for an animated anthology, spin-off, prequel, and sequel, while produced by Amazon, one of the biggest corporations in the world known for many of its own controversies, starring Anthony Starr, who drunkenly attacked someone a few years ago, and Eric Kripke saying that rape is funny. Even by the end of the show, Vought, the big mega corporation, doesn't face many consequences. The machine just keeps on turning, just like Amazon keeps on turning out these shows. So are these new shows going to be more of like, haha, what if superheroes were bad, and what if we were just super extreme and there's like sexism and gore and blah, it's all crazy? I mean, like, what left is there really to cover here? To be fair though, the comic did get some spin-offs as well, but they were pretty short. And most topical of all, now that the show is wrapped up, I do agree that the finale of The Boys was a little bit dry. Homelander never really cuts loose. The scorched earth showdown between the heroes and villains amounts to a fight in the Oval Office, and the superhero status quo doesn't really change because The Boys Mexico still needs to happen. It was underwhelming, but it wasn't terrible. Some characters get their moments, and the performances are still great. Though, it did have blatant false advertising from the marketing department, so you can blame them, I guess. Well, I've got my own personal likes and dislikes with the show and the comic. Now that both are finished, I ask myself, is the comic actually better than the show? Most of the time, people will say without a shadow of a doubt that the show is better, but I think an argument could be made that the comic might actually be better in the end, in that it doesn't hold back. It is the true, unfiltered vision of what this world would be like. And that could be unpleasant to read, but shouldn't it be? It's an evil world there. However, I also think the opposite could be said as well. Is the comic worse because it shows no restraint? The Amazon series is able to take the evil of the comic and humanize it to a degree. Might it not be more scary to think about these horrible monsters that aren't actually so different from us? It's an interesting point to consider because I think the changes that the show makes to the comic could be viewed as either an enhancement or watering down of the original story with equally appealing arguments. The Boys was appealing when it first released in 2019 because it hit at the right time, but 7 years have passed since the show first began, and I'm not so sure that people even want to make fun of superheroes anymore. When you look at the kind of superhero stories that are popular now, they're far more earnest and colorful than the grim, dark, pessimistic view that this story provides. Perhaps The Boys' time in the limelight has come. Not that that's a bad thing. It had its cultural importance, but culture changes as time moves forward. But even when you take into account what people actually want from the superhero genre, you're now seeing just how popular other stories are becoming. Take The Backrooms, for instance. A fairly low-budget horror film from first-time director Kane Parsons based on his creepypasta-type web series on YouTube. That's now a major theatrical release, and frankly, much bigger in the zeitgeist, yes, I'm using another vocab word, than The Boys' finale was. The Backrooms on the internet has always been sort of popular, but The Boys was massive. Now it seems like not only is superhero satire kind of going out of fashion, but major CGI, action-heavy films and TV as well. Even though superheroes aren't going anywhere, let's be real. I just wanted to point out how big of a hit this movie ended up being, especially when you look at how The Boys' finale kind of floundered a little bit. That's a fish pun, like the deep. He's dead now.
The only one who was nearly as strong as me.
The way I see it, The Boys comic and show have their own unique strengths and weaknesses. Now you can call that a cop-out answer if you want, but I truly believe it is a result of the time periods they were released in, and especially the mediums they occupy. Obviously, since this is my video, I've done a lot of yapping about this, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think of The Boys comic? What do you think of the show? Do you think the show is better than the comic? Vice versa. Are you looking forward to these various spin-offs and continuations of the TV universe, or do you now have interest in reading the comic since the show is done? And perhaps most importantly, is the age of the superhero adaptation coming to an end, or just shifting into something more sincerely appreciative of the genre, unlike a lot of Garth Ennis' more cynical work? I just asked you 1,000 questions, but please, whatever your answers are, tell me them in the comments below, and I'll be sure to cook up some more stuff in the meantime as I read through them. This was a video a long time in the making. I knew one day I would talk about The Boys when the show finally wrapped up, show and the comic, which is kind of the focus of this. I'm more so comparing the show to the comic, and now we're here. Except we won't be here much longer because this is the end of the video. Time to leave. Go write a comment. I'm out of here. All right, see you next time.